spent 19 years building something I didn't own. That's the part people don't understand when I tell this story. They hear the ending. The frozen licenses, the collapsed acquisition, the phone call I didn't make, and they think it's a story about revenge. It's not. It's a story about 19 years of knowing exactly what you're worth, and the particular kind of quiet that settles over you when someone finally confirms it. My name is not important. What matters is what I did, and what I knew, and what happened when I walked out the door carrying a banker's box and a thermos of coffee that had gone cold somewhere around the 3rd floor. I was the director of environmental compliance at Hartwell Construction Group. Hartwell built things: warehouses, distribution centers, light industrial facilities, the kind of structures that don't make architecture magazines but keep the American economy moving. We operated across 11 states. We had active permits in 6 of them at any given time. We had ongoing relationships with state environmental agencies in all 11, relationships built over years of consistent reporting, honest communication, and the occasional difficult conversation where I had to tell a regulatory contact that one of our project managers had made a mistake, and here's exactly how we were fixing it. I built those relationships, every single one. Before I came to Hartwell, the company had paid 2 significant fines in 3 years for stormwater violations. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to put them on a watch list with the EPA regional office and flag them for enhanced inspection protocols. My predecessor, a good man who simply didn't have the regulatory background the job required, had treated compliance as a paperwork function. File the reports, check the boxes, move on. I came in and rebuilt it from the ground up. I wrote the SPCC plans. I designed the stormwater pollution prevention protocols for each project type. I created the internal audit system that caught potential violations before they became reportable incidents. I trained the field supervisors. I established the relationships with the state agency contacts, the actual human beings sitting in the regional offices who would pick up the phone when I called because they knew that when I called, I wasn't hiding anything. That last part is worth understanding. In environmental compliance, the relationship with your regulatory contacts is not a formality. It is infrastructure. When an inspector shows up unannounced on a job site, and they absolutely do, the first thing they're doing is taking the temperature of the interaction. Are these people cooperative? Do they know what they're doing? Do they seem like they have something to hide? 19 years of building a reputation as someone who doesn't hide things is worth more than any legal defense you can buy after the fact. I knew this. The people who ran Hartwell when I was hired knew this. The people who ran Hartwell for the first 15 years of my tenure knew this. The people who took over after the private equity acquisition, it turned out, did not know this at all. The firm was called Beacon Ridge Capital. They bought a controlling stake in Hartwell about 2.5 years ago. The previous owner, a second-generation family man named Mr. Hartwell, the son of the founder who had gray hair and a handshake like a hydraulic press, he had built the company into something real. 40 years, from a 3-truck operation in central Ohio to a regional contractor with a solid balance sheet and a reputation that meant something. He sold because his children had no interest in the business, and he was 73 years old and tired in the way that men get tired when they've been carrying something heavy for a very long time. I understood that. I respected it. What came next, I did not respect. Beacon Ridge installed a new CEO about 4 months after the acquisition closed. His name was Stratton. Early 40s, sharp dresser, the kind of man who says bandwidth when he means time and ecosystem when he means industry and leverage in about 11 different contexts per conversation. He had a background in private equity operations, which is a thing that sounds very specific but often means a person has learned to read financial statements and manage PowerPoint presentations across a variety of industries without developing deep expertise in any of them. He was not unintelligent. I want to be fair about that. He was good at certain things. He was good at meetings. He was good at meetings the quarterly numbers look clean. He was good at the kind of high-level strategic thinking that impresses people who have never had to execute the strategy. What he did not understand, what he fundamentally, structurally did not understand, was that Hartwell Construction Group was not a tech startup or a consumer goods company. It was a construction operation working across 11 states under a complex web of federal and state environmental regulations, active permits, consent agreements, and ongoing compliance obligations that had real legal consequences if you got them wrong. You could not simply optimize the org chart in an operation like that the way you might restructure a sales team. The org chart, in this case, had load-bearing walls. I tried to explain this to him. More than once. In more than one format. The first time was about 6 months into his tenure, when he announced a general operational efficiency review and asked all department heads to prepare presentations on their team structures. I prepared mine carefully. I walked him through the regulatory landscape, the Clean Water Act permits, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act obligations, the state-level variances we'd negotiated over the years, the consent order we were still operating under in 2 states from before my tenure, the specific personal relationships with agency contacts that represented years of institutional trust. I used a phrase that I've used with executives before when I need them to understand something that isn't intuitive to them: compliance infrastructure. The systems and relationships that keep a company like this operating legally are not overhead. They are infrastructure. You can't see them on a balance sheet, but the moment they fail, you feel it everywhere. He nodded through the whole presentation. At the end he said, "Great context, really helpful," and I thought maybe I had gotten through to him. I had not gotten through to him. About 8 months ago, I walked into work on a Tuesday morning and found a calendar invite for a one-on-one meeting with Stratton at 2 o'clock. No agenda. That's always a bad sign. In my experience, no agenda meetings with the CEO fall into 2 categories: the kind where they want to give you good news and are making it feel casual, and the kind where they want to tell you something uncomfortable and are hoping the lack of a formal agenda makes it feel less official. The body language in the conference room told me which kind this was, before he said a word. He did the preamble thing that people do when they're about to say something they know is problematic. A lot of words about transformation and evolution and the company being at a pivotal inflection point. I let him finish. I have been in enough of these conversations to know that interrupting them only makes them longer. Then he told me they were restructuring the compliance function. In the new structure, my role, Director of Environmental Compliance, was being realigned. A new position was being created, Vice President of Regulatory Affairs, which would oversee compliance along with government relations and some public affairs functions. And they had identified the right person for that role: his brother-in-law. I want to be precise here because the details matter. Not his brother. His brother-in-law. A man I'll call his family member, because that's the relevant fact. Not the specific relationship, but the fact that the relationship was familial and not professional. This person had spent the previous 12 years in, and I am not making this up, commercial real estate. He had no environmental compliance background. He had no regulatory affairs experience in the construction or industrial sector. He had no established relationships with the EPA regional offices or the state agencies we worked with. He had, as far as I could determine, no particular expertise in anything that the actual job required. What he had was a brother-in-law who was the CEO. Stratton explained this to me with the particular tone that people use when they're trying to make an indefensible decision sound like a business strategy. Something about bringing in fresh perspective and cross-functional leadership, and the new VP would rely on my expertise during a knowledge transition period. I sat with that phrase for a moment. Knowledge transition period. 19 years of compliance infrastructure, 10 years of EPA relationships, a consent order we were actively managing in 2 states. And the plan was to transition that knowledge to someone who had been selling commercial real estate in Atlanta 12 months ago. I looked at him across the conference table, and I thought about the permit renewal application we had pending with the Ohio EPA. I thought about the stormwater inspection scheduled for the site in Kentucky. I thought about the annual certification we were required to submit to the EPA regional office by the end of the next quarter, which required a licensed professional engineer's signature and which I had been managing for 7 years. I thought about the construction general permit in Indiana that had a compliance schedule with specific deadlines, and what happens when a company misses those deadlines. I thought about all of that, and I smiled. Not a big smile. A small one. The kind of smile you have when you understand the full shape of a situation, and the other person in the room only understands about a third of it. I told him I appreciated him letting me know directly. I told him I would give the transition my full cooperation. I shook his hand. Then I went back to my office, and I started making a list. I want to be clear about what that list was. It was not a list of things to sabotage or damage or leave incomplete. I have never operated that way, and I never will. What I built at Hartwell, I built because it was the right way to operate a construction company with environmental obligations. The systems worked because they were good systems, not because I was the only one who could run them. If the right person had taken over my role, those systems would have continued working. The list I made was a documentation list. Every active permit, its status, its next deadline, its specific requirements. every consent obligation and its current standing, every regulatory contact, name, agency, relationship history, last interaction, every internal audit that was scheduled or overdue, every certification that needed to be renewed and by when. I was going to document everything completely and correctly and hand it over in perfect condition, because that's what a competent person does, and because I knew, with the particular certainty that comes from 19 years of experience, that a complete and accurate documentation package would make the gaps in the incoming VP's preparation unmistakably clear. Not to me, to the regulatory agencies. I gave my formal notice 3 weeks later. Standard 2-week notice, but I offered to stay for an additional month to support the transition. They took me up on it. During that month, I did exactly what I said I would do. I documented everything. I prepared transition briefings. I walked Stratton's brother-in-law through the major compliance obligations, speaking slowly and clearly and watching him write things down that told me he didn't fully understand what he was writing. He asked me at one point about the consent order in Ohio. He wanted to know if it was still a big deal. I explained that a consent order is a legally binding agreement with a regulatory agency. Missing a milestone is a violation. Violations under active consent orders receive heightened scrutiny. The word big deal doesn't really apply to federal compliance obligations the way it might apply to, say, a lease negotiation. He nodded and wrote something in his notebook. I finished the month, picked up my box, and walked out. I'd accepted a position with a smaller regional firm. Less money, less scope, but a management team that actually understood what environmental compliance was. I was looking forward to it. I was also, I will admit, curious about what was going to happen at Hartwell. I didn't have to wait very long to find out. Stratton had been working through most of my last year on what was apparently a significant acquisition, a competing construction group in the Mid-Atlantic region. The deal had been in negotiation for months. I knew about it in general terms. These things circulate at the management level. The target company had operations in Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, and acquiring them would have expanded Hartwell's footprint substantially. Beacon Ridge Capital had been driving the deal as part of their growth strategy. The number I had heard associated with it was in the range of $38 to $42 million. Here's the thing about acquisitions in the construction sector that people outside the industry don't always appreciate. Regulatory standing is a material due diligence item. When you acquire a construction company, you're not just acquiring their equipment and their contracts and their relationships with general contractors. You're acquiring their permits. You're acquiring their compliance history. You're acquiring any outstanding violations, any consent agreements, any enforcement actions, and this is the part that mattered here. Before a significant acquisition can close, the acquiring company's own regulatory standing gets examined, because the combined entity needs clean standing to operate. What the acquiring company needs, specifically, is to demonstrate that they have qualified personnel in place to manage the combined compliance obligations. The Environmental Protection Agency does not simply take your word for it. They look at credentials. They look at experience. They look at the actual human beings you're telling them are responsible for keeping your operations legal. They also look at whether you have any open issues. About 6 weeks after I left Hartwell, I got a call from my old contact at the Ohio EPA regional office. Not an official call. A personal one. She had known me for 11 years. We had worked through the consent order together. She was calling, she said, because she wanted me to know that Hartwell had submitted documentation related to the consent order milestone review and that the documentation appeared to have been prepared by someone who was not fully familiar with the specific requirements of the consent agreement. She wasn't telling me this because she wanted my help. She was telling me because she respected the relationship we'd built and she thought I might have concerns I wasn't aware of. She was, in her professional way, giving me a heads up that things were not going smoothly over there. I thanked her. I told her I had left the company. I told her I had no ongoing involvement. She said she understood. She said she hoped I was doing well. 3 weeks after that phone call, I heard through the industry network, the way you hear things in a mid-size industry, through former colleagues and professional contacts, that the Hartwell acquisition was in trouble. The target company's attorneys had flagged something during due diligence. Specifically, they had flagged that Hartwell's current director, technically vice president of regulatory affairs, had submitted documentation to the EPA regional office in connection with a consent order that contained errors inconsistent with what a qualified environmental compliance professional would produce. The target company was not prepared to proceed with the transaction until Hartwell could demonstrate that its compliance function was being managed by someone with appropriate credentials and experience. This is not a minor condition. This is the kind of condition that stops a deal, but there was more. Because when the EPA regional office received that documentation, the documentation prepared by Stratton's brother-in-law, it triggered something I had understood was a possibility but had not known for certain would happen. When compliance documentation submitted by a regulated entity contains significant errors, the agency has an obligation to assess whether those errors indicate systemic issues with the company's compliance program. In Hartwell's case, given that they were already operating under a consent order in 2 states, that assessment carried particular weight. The EPA regional office notified Hartwell that the errors in the submitted documentation were being reviewed as a potential indicator of inadequate compliance management. They requested a meeting. They requested documentation of the qualifications of the new VP of Regulatory Affairs. The meeting did not go well, by all accounts. Meanwhile, the EPA permit renewal application, the one in Ohio that I had spent 7 months preparing before I left, had been submitted under my name because it was submitted while I was still there. But the follow-up correspondence, the responses to the agency's technical questions, the supplemental materials they requested, those were handled by my replacement. And the responses were inadequate, not dishonest. I don't believe there was any intentional misrepresentation, simply inadequate, the work of someone who did not fully understand what they were doing. By the time I was 3 months into my new job, Hartwell was dealing with 3 separate regulatory issues simultaneously: the consent order documentation problem, the permit renewal complications, and the acquisition due diligence flag. Each one, individually, was manageable. Together they created what regulators call a pattern. And patterns in environmental compliance attract attention in ways that individual incidents do not. I got a call from Stratton. This surprised me. We had not spoken since I left. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon, which was, coincidentally, the day I was reviewing draft documentation for my new employer's annual stormwater permit certification, something I had established as a priority in my first week. He asked if we could talk. His voice had the quality of someone who has been in a very long meeting and the meeting has not been going the way he hoped. I said yes. He explained the situation, which I already knew most of from the industry contacts and the Ohio EPA call. He asked if I would consider coming back to help stabilize the compliance function. Not permanently, just on a consulting basis, long enough to get through the regulatory issues and close the acquisition. I want to tell you that I said no immediately and left it there. I didn't. I listened to everything he had to say. I asked a few questions, mainly to understand the full scope of what had gone wrong, because some of it I hadn't known. Then I told him that I appreciated him reaching out. I told him that I understood why he was asking, and I told him that I wasn't available, not because I wanted him to suffer, not because I was holding a grudge. I told him I wasn't available because I had accepted a new position and I had commitments there that I took seriously. And the situation in Hartwell had become what it had become because of decisions he had made, and the appropriate path forward was to hire someone qualified, someone with the actual credentials and experience the job required. I gave him the name of a colleague in the industry who did exactly that kind of remediation consulting, a very good compliance professional who would charge appropriately for the work and would do it correctly. He thanked me. He sounded, I thought, like a man beginning to understand the full shape of a situation. The acquisition did not close in the second quarter as planned. The regulatory review extended the timeline significantly. The target company's patience, from what I heard, had limits. The deal eventually closed. I heard about it maybe 8 months later, but at a reduced valuation, with an extended remediation commitment built into the terms, and with a new VP of Regulatory Affairs who had an actual environmental science degree and 15 years of construction compliance experience. Stratton's brother-in-law, I was told, moved into a business development role, which is, I suppose, a more appropriate use of a commercial real estate background. The consent order in Ohio was extended by 18 months due to the documentation issues. Enhanced supervisory attention. Quarterly reporting requirements instead of annual. Site inspections at the agency's discretion rather than on a scheduled basis. That's not catastrophic. But it's expensive, and it's intrusive, and it's exactly the kind of thing that poisons the relationship between a company and its regulatory contacts for years. I think about the employees at Hartwell sometimes. The project managers and the site supervisors and the administrative staff who had nothing to do with this decision and who worked every day in a company that was suddenly dealing with regulatory complications and a delayed acquisition and all the uncertainty that comes with those things. They didn't deserve that. They were good people doing their jobs. I think about the field supervisors I trained, the ones who knew how to manage a stormwater control measure correctly and file a proper inspection report and what to say and what not to say when an inspector showed up on site. They had internalized the right way to do this work. The compliance culture I'd built over 19 years existed in them even when the person nominally in charge of compliance didn't know what they were doing. That's what institutional knowledge actually is. It's not a person. It's not a manual. It's a way of doing things that gets absorbed into the fabric of an organization over years and years of consistent practice. You can transfer it deliberately, through careful documentation and patient training, to the right successor. You cannot transfer it overnight to someone who was chosen for reasons that had nothing to do with competence. The moment a leader believes that expertise is interchangeable, that the specific knowledge accumulated over a career in a regulated industry can be replaced by a family connection and a title, that's when the consequences start accumulating. Quietly, at first, in the form of documentation errors and missed follow-ups and regulatory contacts who stop returning calls quite as quickly as they used to. Then, less quietly. I am doing fine, for what it's worth. The new company is smaller, but the work is good, and the management team asks the right questions. Last month, they closed out a stormwater permit renewal in Virginia in 43 days. The state average is about 90. Because I knew the specific inspector assigned to the region and we had a working relationship, and he trusted that when I submitted documentation, it was going to be complete and accurate. That relationship took years to build. Some things cannot be rushed. Some things cannot be reassigned. Some things you don't appreciate until they're gone and the inspection team is standing at your front door asking for the qualified person responsible for environmental compliance. And the qualified person responsible has been gone for 6 weeks. And the person you put in their place is flipping through a notebook trying to find notes they don't fully understand. I didn't make a single phone call I wasn't supposed to make. I didn't alert anyone or tip anyone off or engineer anything. I documented my work completely, transitioned professionally, and left. The consequences were already built into the decisions that had been made. I just walked out of the way and let them arrive. There's a version of this story where I'm the villain, where I left deliberately to watch things burn, where the timing was calculated malice dressed up as professionalism. I've heard that version. Some people at Hartwell probably believe it. I've stopped trying to correct them. What I know is this. I spent 19 years doing the work correctly. Not perfectly. There were audits I wish I'd caught earlier, documentation I wish I'd structured differently, conversations with agency contacts where I could have been more proactive. But correctly, with integrity, with the understanding that in a regulated industry, the way you do the work is the work. There's no separating them. Stratton never understood that. And I think about why sometimes because it matters more than the outcome of the acquisition. He understood incentives. He understood quarterly metrics. He understood what a balance sheet looks like when a deal closes versus when it doesn't. What he couldn't see, what I genuinely believe was invisible to him, was that some systems exist because they have to exist, not because someone chose to build them. Environmental compliance at a construction company isn't overhead you can optimize. It's the reason you're still allowed to operate. The permits, the agency relationships, the 19 years of documented good faith. Those weren't my personal project. They were the foundation the whole operation stood on. When you can't see the foundation, you make decisions as though it isn't there. That's not a character flaw exactly. It's a knowledge gap. But in positions of authority, a knowledge gap and a character flaw produce the same outcomes. People get hurt. Operations suffer. And the person who made the decision rarely absorbs the full cost of it. That cost distributes across everyone else. The employees who had nothing to do with it, the project managers trying to do their jobs while the company is suddenly under enhanced regulatory scrutiny. The workers on job sites in Kentucky and Ohio who just wanted to finish the pour and go home. I think about them more than I think about Stratton. What I've come to understand, at this point in my career, is that integrity is not about traumatic moments. It's not about the choice you make when someone is watching or when the stakes are obvious. It's about the choices you make in 19 years of ordinary Tuesdays when no one particularly cares whether your stormwater documentation is excellent or merely adequate. Excellence in those moments doesn't feel like virtue. It feels like habit. It feels sometimes like stubbornness, but habits compound. The relationship I had with my contact at the Ohio EPA didn't appear overnight. It was built in dozens of small interactions over 11 years. Calls I returned promptly, errors I reported before they became violations, corrections I made without being asked. That relationship was the infrastructure. And when the infrastructure was gone, the consequences were already waiting. I didn't engineer that. I just refused to be careless for 19 years and then I left. There's something worth sitting with in that. The most consequential thing I did at Hartwell wasn't any single decision or any single project. It was simply the consistent choice, repeated over thousands of days, to do the work the right way when doing it the wrong way would have been easier and no one would have noticed. That's not heroism, it's just professionalism. But professionalism, sustained over time, builds something that can't be replaced overnight. And that fact, eventually, has a way of becoming very clear to everyone involved. I'm still building it at the new company. Quietly, on ordinary Tuesdays. That's the only way it works.